The latch had been broken for 3 weeks. Eleanor Ashworth stood on a chair in the blue room at 6:30, screwdriver in hand, candle burning on the sill, trying to fix it before her mother woke. This was how most of her mornings began now, finding the thing that had broken overnight and making it hold a little longer: the roof, the kitchen pipes, the garden gate. The house was coming apart quietly, the way things do when no one can afford to stop them, and Eleanor was the only one paying attention. Her mother slept until 10. Ashworth Park had been a fine house once. It still looked fine from the drive: tall windows, good bones, the kind of entrance that made visitors pause. But visitors didn't see the water stain spreading across the east corridor ceiling, or the drawing room wallpaper lifting at the corners, or the fact that the staff had gone from 11 to 3, and the 3 who remained hadn't been paid in full since August. Eleanor kept a list. She always kept a list. The screw caught. She tested the latch, felt it hold, and climbed down. Outside, rain was beginning against the glass. The grass needed cutting. It would not be cut. She went to make tea before the day required her to be someone else. Her mother came downstairs looking beautiful, as she always did. Cecilia Ashworth was 52 and wore it like a performance. Dove-gray gown, perfect posture, the unhurried manner of a woman who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around her. Eleanor's father had been dead for 2 years. Her mother had spent those 2 years becoming, somehow, more composed. "You were up early," her mother said, accepting the tea without looking at the cup. The latch again. Her mother looked out at the rain. Then, lightly, the way she always introduced things she wanted to seem unimportant. "I had a note from Lady Carow. She mentioned that Duke Ashford was asking after you at the Pembridge supper." Eleanor said nothing. "He apparently made quite a point of it." "Lady Carow makes a point of everything." Her mother smiled, warm, patient, utterly unmoved. "He is a very distinguished man. He is 53. 51, I believe. How precise of you." The smile held. It always held. Eleanor drank her tea and felt the familiar low unease of a conversation that was going somewhere she could not yet see. The solicitor came on a Wednesday. Eleanor heard him at the door, heard her mother's voice in the hall, heard the particular silence that followed, the kind that meant something was being decided without her. She came out of the study before anyone could stop her. "I'll join you," she said. "It isn't necessary, Eleanor. I manage the accounts, Mama." Her mother looked at her a moment. "You are not aware of all of it," she said quietly, and walked into the drawing room. Eleanor followed. Mr. Colville spoke for 19 minutes. He spoke about the mortgage, extended twice since her father's death and unable to be extended again. He spoke about the outstanding creditors, the furniture merchant, the wine merchant, the village tradesman waiting since spring. He spoke about the total sum owed, which was £400 more than Eleanor had calculated. "In practical terms," he said, folding his hands, "you have until the end of February. If the arrears are not settled, the bank will move to call the loan. Ashworth Park would need to be sold." Sold. The word dropped into the room and stayed there. "And what would remain after the debts were cleared?" her mother asked, perfectly steady. "Very little, I'm afraid." Eleanor looked at the mantelpiece, the French clock, the blue china dogs, her father's miniature portrait. In 3 months they would belong to someone else. She sat very still and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Her mother waited until the following morning, until Eleanor was tired and halfway through cold toast, and then came downstairs looking fragile and sat down carefully and said, "I didn't sleep. It is worry, Eleanor, for you, for what becomes of us." She looked up. "Duke Ashford is a good man." Eleanor put down her toast. "He is wealthy and respected and has shown a particular interest in you." Her mother's voice was soft, almost sorrowful. "I am not asking you to do anything. I am only asking you to consider." She reached across and placed her hand over Eleanor's. "I only want what is best for you. You know that." Eleanor looked at her mother's hand, warm, perfectly steady. "Of course," she said. She spent the next 3 weeks looking for another way. She wrote to her father's cousin in Edinburgh, who had mentioned a possible position, managing his correspondence, tutoring his daughter. She wrote 4 times. 1 letter came back with an apology. The position had been filled. The others received no reply. She inquired at the village school. No certificate, no position. She wrote to an aunt in Bristol who had money and had never liked her mother. The aunt wrote back warmly and said nothing useful. Every door opened a crack and then closed. It was only later, standing in the cold hallway with a returned letter in her hand, that she learned her cousin in Edinburgh had received only 1 of her letters, not 4, 1. She stood there for a long moment. Then she folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went to start dinner. She did not confront her mother. She already knew what her mother would say. That night she sat with the account books and went through the numbers one last time. They were the same. Of course they were. Numbers didn't change because you needed them to. 3 months, £400 in arrears, no positions, no aunt, no cousin, her mother asleep upstairs, the gate at the end of the drive still rusting, and the latch in the blue room that she had fixed but would come loose again. She sat for a long time with the candle burning down. Then she closed the books and went to bed. In the morning, she went to her mother's room before breakfast. Her mother was sitting up, awake. Something in her expression, a brief, suppressed alertness, told Eleanor she had been awake for some time. "Eleanor, you're up early." "I'm always up early." Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at her mother, the composed face, the careful eyes, the miniature portrait of Eleanor herself on the bedside table, 8 years old, gap-toothed, taken in a summer that felt like another life. "All right," Eleanor said. Her mother's relief was immediate and real. Eleanor gave her that, and she pressed her hand to her mouth and said, "Oh, my darling," in the voice she kept for moments like this. "Arrange the introduction, whatever Lady Caro requires." She pulled the door shut and went downstairs. She met him a fortnight later at a dinner Lady Caro had organized, with the precision of someone who had spent decades arranging exactly this kind of accident. Duke Arthur Ashford rose when she was introduced, and his expression held something she hadn't expected, a genuine, uncomplicated attention, not the assessment she had braced for, just interest, quiet and real. He was 51 and looked it honestly, silver at the temples, lines at the corners of his eyes, a steadiness to him that her mother had always performed and he simply had. He asked about her reading. He listened to her answers. He was, she understood this within the first 10 minutes, and it made everything worse, a genuinely good man. A good man who did not know he was the last door left. When he smiled at her across the table, she smiled back with everything her mother had spent 22 years teaching her to produce on demand. She smiled the way she had learned to smile that morning, with her mouth and nothing else. The wedding was small, and this account will not linger on it. What matters is what came after. Ashford Manor announced itself from half a mile away. Eleanor saw it through the carriage window as they came over the hill, stone and glass catching the late afternoon light, wings extending on either side like something that had grown rather than been built, surrounded by grounds so precisely kept they looked painted. It was, by any measure, magnificent. She pressed her gloved fingers together in her lap and said nothing. Arthur sat across from her, watching the house with the quiet satisfaction of a man returning to something he loved. He had been attentive throughout the journey, ensuring she was comfortable, filling the silences with the careful conversation of someone who was trying and knew he was trying. She had been grateful for the effort, even as she recognized it for what it was. The carriage stopped. A line of staff had assembled at the entrance, 8 of them standing in order of rank with the precision of a household that had learned to run without a mistress and had learned to run without one well. Arthur handed her down himself. "Welcome to Ashford Manor," he said, and there was something in his voice, not performance, just plainness, that she found she could not dismiss. This is my life now, she thought, and then, because she had learned young that sentiment was a thing you could not afford, she walked inside. The housekeeper, Mrs. Beale, showed Eleanor to her rooms. They were on the first floor, east-facing, and they were beautiful. Not the cold beauty of the rest of the house, which was grand in the way of somewhere preserved rather than lived in, but something more deliberate. Fresh flowers on the writing desk, a fire already lit, books arranged on the shelves beside it, a small, careful selection. "His Grace asked that the shelves be stocked according to your interests," Mrs. Beale said. "He made inquiries." Eleanor looked at the books. Poetry, natural history, 2 novels she had mentioned in passing at Lady Caro's dinner. He had been paying attention then. He had listened and remembered and done something with it. She touched the spine of the closest volume and felt, unexpectedly, the particular cruelty of kindness that arrives too late to change anything. Arthur came to find her before dinner. He knocked, which she had not expected, and waited for her to answer, which she had expected even less. When she opened the door, he was standing in the corridor looking slightly uncertain, the most human she had yet seen him. "I wanted to ask whether there is anything you require, anything not arranged to your satisfaction. Everything has been arranged beautifully. The rooms are adequate. I wasn't certain about the east-facing aspect. The rooms are perfect, Arthur." He looked at her when she used his name, a brief, involuntary thing, gone before she could examine it. "Good," he said. "That's good." He paused. "My nephew joins us this evening, Nicholas. He has lived here for the past several years. He was not entirely in favor of, that is to say, of the marriage. He is protective." Arthur looked briefly as though he wished he had not begun this line of conversation. "He has his reasons. In any case, dinner at 8, if that suits." "Of course." He nodded and left. Eleanor closed the door and stood for a moment looking at the fire. He was not entirely in favor. She thought about this. Then she went to dress. Nicholas Vane was already standing when she entered the dining room. He was younger than she had imagined, early 30s, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been called handsome if his expression were not so thoroughly closed. He bowed when Arthur introduced him, said the correct things, and then he looked at her, Not for long, not obviously, and in that brief moment she saw exactly what he thought. Not cruelty, not contempt, just certainty. You are here because of what this house costs. We both know it. Eleanor looked back at him steadily. She had grown up in a house where everything was pretended and nothing was said directly. She was not unacquainted with an honest face. "Mr. Vane," she said. "Your Grace," he said, and the absence of warmth confirmed what his eyes had already told her. She reached for her wine. He was right, of course. That was the part she could not dismiss. She had come here because of 3 months and £400, and a gate rusting at the end of a drive she would never walk again. The accuracy of his judgment did not make it less insulting. If anything, it made it more. She spent the dinner being impeccably pleasant and did not look at him again. Over the following days, Eleanor learned the shape of her new life. Arthur rose at 6 and rode before breakfast, a habit of 30 years that nothing would interrupt. He was considerate of her time and entirely unconscious of her routine. He remembered to ask after her preferences and then forgot gently that she had them. He was not unkind. He simply moved through the house on rails he had laid decades before, and there was not quite room on them for another person. She found her way around the manor by herself. She met with Mrs. Beale over the household books. She walked the grounds in the mornings, the formal gardens first, then further out to the orchard, the lake, the edge of the parkland where the old oaks stood in a line like something from another century. She was building a life from the outside in. She was not sure what the inside would look like when she got there. Her mother wrote on the 3rd day, "My darling girl, the house in Bath is really so small and damp. I wonder whether it might be possible to arrange something closer. There is surely room at the Manor." Eleanor put the letter down and went to find Arthur. He was in his study, reading. He looked up with the expression of a man still mildly surprised to find a wife in his house and working on finding it natural. "My mother has written. She is suggesting she might come to stay." "For how long?" "Indefinitely, I believe, if it were left to her." He looked at her carefully. He was a perceptive man, she was learning. He knew when a conversation was not about what it appeared to be. "And what would you like?" he asked. She had not expected him to ask. "I would like her to remain in Bath. I will visit her." "Then that is what we will tell her." "She will not take it well." "No," he said, with the mild equanimity of a man unbothered by the poor tempers of women he did not have to live with. "I don't suppose she will." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "Thank you. There is nothing to thank me for." She wrote to her mother that afternoon. Her mother wrote back within the week. 3 pages, hurt and bewildered and quietly devastating, the way she always was. Eleanor read it twice, put it in the drawer, and did not take it out again. She had drawn a line. It was a small thing, but it was hers. She had been at the Manor for 9 days when she found the library. Not that it was hidden, she simply had not yet been in that wing. When she opened the door, she found floor-to-ceiling shelves, a fire already lit, the smell of old paper and beeswax, and the particular quiet of a room that had been well used and well loved. She spent 2 hours there that evening, not reading, too restless for reading, walking the shelves, pulling books out, building a map of Arthur's mind from his choices: history, Greek philosophy, military biography, 3 shelves of estate management, and then, tucked in a corner near the window, poetry, a great deal of it, the spines worn with use. She took one down, found margin notes in small, careful handwriting. She was standing at the window reading them when the door opened. Nicholas Vane stopped in the doorway. A half-second before his expression reassembled itself, a flash of something unguarded, gone before she could name it. "I wasn't aware you were here," he said. "Evidently." She closed the book. "Am I in your way?" "No." He came in, went to the desk in the far corner, began looking through papers. He had been using this room, she understood. It had the particular settled quality of a space someone worked in regularly. She should have left. She stayed. "These margin notes," she said, "are they Arthur's?" "Yes." "He reads poetry." "He always has." Nicholas didn't look up. "He doesn't speak of it. He thinks it an embarrassing habit for a man of his position." "That seems a shame." "Most things people hide seem a shame from the outside."
She looked at him. He was still looking at his papers, but his jaw was set in the way of someone aware of being looked at. "You don't like me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know you." "That isn't what I said." He looked up. His eyes were steadier than she had registered at dinner, and he looked at her with the directness of someone who had decided honesty was less work than pretense. "No," he said, "I don't suppose it is." "You think I married him for the money." "I think," he said carefully, "that you were placed in a situation where the money was difficult to overlook." She stared at him. It was, she thought, the most precisely accurate thing anyone had said to her in months, more accurate in its way than anything her mother had managed in all her careful, loving architecture of the situation. And it had come from the one person in this house who was supposed to be her adversary. She put the book back on the shelf. "Good night, Mr. Vane," she said. She was at the door when he spoke. "He is a good man." His voice was quiet, the hostility gone, leaving something more complicated. "Whatever else you make of this, whatever else is true, he is a good man. Try not to forget that." Eleanor stood with her hand on the door frame. She did not answer him. The door closed behind her, and she stood in the corridor for a moment, alone in the large and quiet house, with the sounds of the fire on one side of the door and silence on the other. He is a good man. She already knew that. That was the part that had always been the problem.
London in the season was a machine, and Eleanor had learned to run it. The invitations began arriving within a week of their coming to the townhouse, thick cream envelopes, 2 and 3 a day, addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Ashford. Eleanor opened them at the breakfast table, while Arthur read his correspondence across from her, and she sorted them by date and obligation and the particular social calculus she had been taught since childhood. Who could be declined, who could not, who would remember a slight for years, and who would not notice. She had grown up watching her mother do this. She had simply never had the resources to do it properly. Now she did. She was good at it. The ease with which she moved through ballrooms, the way conversation came without effort, the smile that arrived on time and stayed as long as required. Her mother had spent 22 years preparing her for exactly this, and the preparation had taken. She was a duchess. She looked like one. She behaved like one. What no one could see was the slight remove behind her eyes, the part of her that was always, slightly, watching herself perform. Arthur watched her with open satisfaction.
He stood beside her at their first official dinner, and she felt him take in the room's response to her, the attention she drew, the ease of her conversation, and she understood with no particular bitterness what she was to him, an acquisition made well, a choice vindicated. He was pleased in the uncomplicated way of a man whose judgment had been confirmed.
He was not cold about it. He was warm, even. He touched her hand in company. He remembered to ask most mornings how she had slept. On evenings they stayed in, he sometimes came to sit with her, and they talked. Or he talked, and she listened. And occasionally she said something, and he listened too, or appeared to. But there was a quality to his attention she could not quite name, as though she were not a person exactly, more like a very fine room he had furnished with care and now enjoyed inhabiting. She thought about the margin notes in the poetry books, a small, careful handwriting, the man who loved something and was embarrassed by it. She thought, I am not sure he knows how to let anyone in. She was not sure either that he was trying. Her mother arrived in London in the second week of March, not to visit, to stay, in a small but well-appointed flat in Mayfair, for which, Eleanor learned from the household accounts, Arthur was paying the rent. She had not been consulted. When she raised it with Arthur, he looked briefly uncomfortable and said that her mother had written to him directly and that it had seemed unkind to refuse a woman in delicate health a chance to be near her daughter. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Of course, she said. She called on her mother the following afternoon. Her mother received her in a sitting room already arranged with her own things, the French clock, the blue china dogs, objects that had been in Ashworth Park 3 months ago and were now here, installed as though they had always belonged. You've settled in quickly, Eleanor said. I find I adapt, her mother smiled, pleased with herself in the particular way she always was when a plan had worked. And it is so much easier to see you here. The manor was rather far. Eleanor looked at the china dogs. Arthur is very generous, her mother added. Yes, said Eleanor, he is. She stayed for 40 minutes, said everything that was required, and left. On the street outside, she stood for a moment in the cold air and felt with great clarity that she had drawn a line in Bath, and her mother had simply walked around it. Her mother began appearing. At dinners first, introduced by Eleanor because not introducing her would have caused a scene. Then at afternoon calls, where she arrived at houses Eleanor had not mentioned to her and was received with the delighted curiosity people reserve for the unexpected. Then at the dressmaker's, where Eleanor arrived for a fitting and found her mother already there, chatting with the proprietress like an old friend. The Duchess's mother. That was the currency. Eleanor watched her spend it with the practiced ease of someone who had always known exactly what she was worth and had simply been waiting for the right exchange rate. She was charming, her mother. It was one of the things that made her difficult to argue with. She was so pleasant about everything, so warm, so entirely convinced of her own good intentions. People liked her immediately. Arthur liked her. Nicholas did not. The dinner was at Lord and Lady Pemberton's, 14 guests, and Eleanor's mother had been included in the party. She watched Nicholas from across the table. He was watching her mother. Not obviously. Nicholas rarely did anything obviously. But she had learned the particular quality of his attention, the way he went still and focused when thinking hard about something. His eyes moved between her mother and Eleanor. His glass sat untouched. After dinner, while the party moved to the drawing room, he fell into step beside her. She is very accomplished, he said quietly. Not a compliment. She is. She has mentioned the Ashford connection 4 times this evening. I counted. She is proud of her daughter's marriage.
Is that what it is? He was quiet for a moment. Then, she is using you. She always has. Eleanor stopped walking. She turned to look at him. His expression was not unkind. That was almost worse. You know nothing about my family, she said. No, he agreed. I don't. She went into the drawing room and smiled for the remaining 2 hours of the evening without a single moment of difficulty, because she had been trained for exactly this. That night she lay awake until past 3 and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. She is using you. She always has. The thing about an accurate statement, Eleanor was finding, was that it did not go away simply because you had refused to accept it. The moment with Arthur happened on a Thursday evening, at home. They were in the sitting room after dinner, just the two of them. Nicholas had gone out. Eleanor reading while Arthur worked through his correspondence. It was their version of domestic peace, two people occupying the same space without quite occupying it together. She looked up from her book. I've been reading through the estate records. Arthur looked up. Have you? The South cottages, empty since July, falling into disrepair. I wondered whether they might be let. There seems to be demand in the village, and they're sound enough structurally. They only need... He set down his letter, and she felt a small, cautious thing open in her chest, the hope that this was a conversation they were actually going to have. I'll mention it to Hartley. He'll know the situation better than the records suggest. Of course, but I thought, he's been with us 20 years, reliable man. He smiled at her, the warm, pleasant smile he gave when he considered a matter settled. Don't trouble yourself with the estate accounts, Eleanor. That's what Hartley is for. He returned to his letter. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her book. The words on the page meant nothing. She read the same sentence 4 times. Don't trouble yourself. Gently said, kindly meant, the way you might speak to someone who had tried to help and nearly knocked something over. She had managed a household at 22. She had kept Ashworth Park running on arithmetic and determination, while her mother rearranged ornaments and complained about the damp. She had read the Ashford estate records cover to cover and identified something his manager had apparently overlooked. But she was the decoration. She had always been the decoration. She had simply failed to understand, until this moment, that Arthur knew it too, and saw nothing wrong with it. She closed her book. I think I'll retire. Good night, he said, warmly, already reading. The Harcastle ball was 3 weeks later, and it was everything a ball in the season was supposed to be. Eleanor moved through it with the ease of practice, the right words to the right people, the small, precise negotiations of precedence and attention that constituted the whole game of evenings like this. She danced twice with Arthur, who danced correctly and with obvious pleasure. She smiled and conversed, and was, by any external measure, a success. But there was a point, around 11 o'clock, when she found herself standing at the edge of the room with a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking, and she felt it. The glass wall that had always been there, and that she had simply been moving too quickly to notice. The room full of people talking to the Duchess of Ashford. The room empty of anyone talking to Eleanor. She looked across the ballroom. Nicholas was standing near the far windows, talking to a woman she didn't recognize, young, laughing at something he'd said. And Nicholas was different. The closed quality was gone. He was leaning slightly forward, genuinely engaged, and he was laughing too, an actual laugh, not the polite version she had seen at dinners. She had not known his face could do that. She looked away, back at the chandelier light scattered across 500 people who had no idea she was standing there. Arthur appeared at her elbow. "Are you all right?" "Perfectly," she said, and smiled at him. "I was just catching my breath." He patted her hand and moved away into the crowd, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the room and breathed. She was 22 years old. She was a duchess. She was very good at all of this. She turned her glass slowly in her hands and watched the light move through it and waited for the evening to be over. The season ended and London released them. Arthur made no secret of his relief. The morning they left the townhouse, he was at the carriage before Eleanor had finished breakfast, and when the city finally gave way to open country, he settled back in his seat with the particular exhale of a man returning to himself. She watched him and thought, this is where he actually lives. Everything else was performance. She understood that better than he knew. Ashford estate was smaller than the manor, older too, the stone darker, the gardens wilder at the edges in a way the manor's precise grounds never were. The house had a different quality, less impressive, more inhabited. The floors were uneven in the old wing. The kitchen garden ran almost to the back door. There were dogs, 2 of them, who appeared from nowhere when the carriage stopped and went directly to Arthur as though they had been waiting. He crouched down to greet them without any self-consciousness at all. Eleanor stood watching this and felt something shift slightly in her understanding of him. The days here had a different shape. No invitations, no dinners requiring orchestration. Arthur rode in the mornings and spent his afternoons with his estate manager, walking the fields, talking to tenants, doing the work he actually cared about. He came to dinner with mud on his boots sometimes and talked about the harvest and the drainage on the north field with an animation he never brought to ballrooms. Eleanor walked. The estate had a kitchen garden, a walled orchard, a long meadow that ran down to a stream, and beyond that, woodland that had not been formally managed in years. She went further each day, learning the land the way she had learned Ashworth Park, by its details, its problems, its particular character. She found a broken gate in the orchard wall and mentioned it to the groundskeeper herself, because it was there and it needed doing. She breathed, for the first time in months, without calculating the breath. Nicholas was there too. Here the house was smaller, the days quieter, and there was nowhere particular to be that kept them from occupying the same spaces. He worked in the library in the mornings. He rode with Arthur sometimes in the afternoons. In the evenings he read or played chess against himself in the corner of the sitting room with the focused quiet of someone who had long ago made peace with his own company. They were not unfriendly. They were not friendly. They existed in the same house with the careful courtesy of 2 people who had agreed, without saying so, to maintain a particular distance. Eleanor told herself this was sensible. She believed it entirely. The rain came on a Tuesday, without warning. She had been out since 2 o'clock, following the path along the stream and up through the meadow toward the old orchard. The sky had been a flat, stable gray, the kind that threatens nothing, and she had not brought her heavier coat. Within 5 minutes it was raining properly, cold, determined, the kind that soaks through wool quickly and without apology. She turned toward the old groundskeeper's cottage at the orchard's edge. It had been empty for years, but the roof was sound. She had checked it herself the week before, out of habit. She pushed the door open and went in. The room was dim, smelled of old wood and damp earth, held a broken chair and a rusted iron stove and nothing else of consequence. Rain hammered the roof.
She pushed wet hair back from her face and watched it come down across the orchard, turning the grass silver. The door opened behind her. Nicholas stood in the frame, as wet as she was, and for a moment they simply looked at each other with the mutual blankness of two people who had each believed themselves alone and were revising that belief. "I was at the far field," he said. "I was at the stream." He came in, pulled the door shut, stood on the other side of the room and looked out the window beside her at the rain. Neither of them said anything for a while. It was the specific quality of a silence between two people who had been carefully avoiding each other and now run out of room to do it in.
"Do you like it here?" he asked. "Not London, here." She considered the question properly, because he had asked it properly. "Yes, more than I expected." "Arthur loves it." "I know, he's different here." "He's himself here." Nicholas was quiet for a moment. "London is a performance he gives. He's good at it, but it costs him." She looked at his profile. "You know him very well." "I've lived with him for 20 years. He paused. "I was 11 when my mother died. Arthur came to collect me in April. I had met him twice before that, I think. And the house was—" He stopped, looked out at the rain. "Very large, very quiet, full of things I wasn't supposed to touch." Eleanor said nothing. She understood, with the precision of someone who had felt a version of the same thing, what it was to be placed in a house where you did not quite belong and were expected to be grateful for the placing. "He was kind," Nicholas said. "Always kind. He sent me to school, took care of everything. I was never made to feel unwanted." He said this carefully, as though locating the exact truth of it. "But I was also never made to feel that I was his. I was the nephew, the ward, the charity case in some lights. I'm not sure he knew how to do it differently. Ease does not come naturally to him, with people." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "I've noticed." He turned to look at her then, and she looked back, and for a moment neither of them deployed the expression they usually kept ready for the other. The wariness, the careful blankness, and in its absence she saw something she had not seen before. He was tired. Not today tired, the other kind. She recognized it because she had it too. "You grew up feeling like a stranger in your own house," she said. It was not quite a question. He held her gaze. "Didn't you?" The rain came down. Somewhere in the orchard, a branch cracked under the weight of water. Eleanor turned back to the window. "Yes," she said, though mine was a different kind of strange. They stood side by side and said nothing more. And when the rain finally eased, they walked back to the house by different paths, not by agreement, just by the natural divergence of two people who had said more than they intended and needed, separately, to think about it. Nothing had happened. She told herself this on the walk back, mud on her boots, wet coat heavy on her shoulders. Nothing had happened. But something had. Her mother arrived on Friday. Arthur had invited her. Another letter Eleanor had not been shown, and she came with 2 trunks and the particular energy of someone who has been waiting for permission. She was charming at dinner and gracious to the staff and utterly warm to Arthur, who responded to her the way most people did, with the uncritical ease of someone being made to feel perceptive and kind. Eleanor watched this and said nothing. On the second day, her mother asked to see the kitchen garden. Eleanor walked her through it, and her mother made the appropriate sounds, and then said lightly, "Arthur seems concerned about you." Eleanor looked at her. "Does he?" "He mentioned that you've seemed rather preoccupied lately, that you spend a great deal of time alone." She touched a rosemary sprig, let it go. "He wondered whether you were perhaps finding it difficult,
adjusting. Eleanor looked at the kitchen garden, the repaired beds, the winter vegetables, the gate she had had fixed the first week. The garden she had quietly, systematically improved because she could not stop herself from fixing things that needed fixing. "I told him you had always been a solitary creature," her mother continued, "that he shouldn't take it personally."
A solitary creature, as though Eleanor's time alone were a character flaw to be explained away, rather than the only hours in her day that belonged to no one's expectations. "Thank you, Mama," Eleanor said, "for explaining me." Her mother smiled, satisfied, and moved on to admire the herb beds. Eleanor stayed where she was for a moment, looking at nothing. She had not known until now that her mother was reporting to Arthur, that the observations were being collected and delivered, helpfully, usefully, with love. She filed this away, the way she filed everything, carefully, for later. Her mother left on Sunday. That evening, Eleanor went to the library. She sat in the chair by the window and listened to the rain that had started again, and watched it trail down the old glass in branching lines. She was still there when she heard footsteps in the corridor. They slowed outside the door, stopped. Nicholas stood in the doorway, not entering, just paused, the way you pause when you see a light under a door you didn't expect. He had a book in one hand. He looked at her, and she looked at him. And a week ago, the look would have been guarded, the usual careful blankness. It wasn't quite tonight. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. He moved on. His footsteps continued down the corridor and disappeared. Eleanor turned back to the rain-streaked window. "Good night." 2 syllables. Nothing in them. And yet she sat there for another hour, not reading, not thinking about anything she could have named, while the rain came down outside and the house settled around her into the specific quiet of a place where something is changing and no one has said so yet. The first thing was the south corridor. Eleanor had noticed that the servants were using a route through the old scullery to reach the upper floors, an unnecessary detour, adding 10 minutes to every trip, because the door at the base of the south corridor had been locked since winter, and no one had thought to unlock it. She found the key herself in the 3rd drawer of the housekeeper's cabinet. She had the door opened and the corridor back in use by Thursday. Arthur found out on Friday. He came to find her in the garden. "Mrs. Beale tells me you've reopened the south corridor," he said. "The staff were walking an unnecessary circuit. It made no sense to keep it closed." "That corridor is closed in winter because the window at the far end lets in cold air and drives up the heating cost. Hartley and I decided this 2 years ago. The window has a broken seal. If you replace it, you recover the corridor without the heat loss. I looked at it yesterday. It's a simple repair." A pause. "I appreciate the thought," he said. "But I'd rather you didn't make changes to the household arrangements without speaking to me first. You haven't been here long enough to understand how things work. You haven't been here long enough." She had been here 4 months. She had read every estate record, memorized every account, learned the name of every tenant and the particular problem each of them had brought to the house in the past year. She knew this house better than most people who had lived in it for decades, because she was constitutionally incapable of living somewhere without understanding it. "Of course," she said. Arthur nodded, satisfied, and went back inside. Eleanor stood in the garden and breathed slowly through her nose until the feeling passed. It passed. It always passed. But it left something behind, each time. The second thing was the dinner. Sir Edmund Carow and his wife came to stay for 3 nights, and Arthur was at his best, engaged, generous, the version of himself Eleanor had first met at Lady Carow's table. At dinner on the second night, she began to say something about the new drainage work on the north field. Arthur had mentioned it at breakfast, had seemed to want to discuss it, and she had read the surveyor's report that afternoon specifically, so she could. The surveyor's recommendations seem sound, she said, though I noticed he hasn't accounted for the gradient change at the eastern edge. If the water table, Hartley thinks we'll have it resolved by spring, Arthur said to Sir Edmund. The man's been managing drainage on this land for 15 years. Sir Edmund nodded. Eleanor finished her sentence in her head and set down her fork. 10 minutes later, she made another observation. Smaller. Lighter. Nothing contentious. Arthur talked over it without appearing to notice he had done so. Lady Caro caught her eye for just a moment, with the careful non-expression of a woman who has seen this before and knows better than to acknowledge it. Eleanor reached for her wine. At the far end of the table, Nicholas was looking at his plate. He had heard. She knew he had heard, because Nicholas heard everything. When he looked up and met her eyes, his expression held something she had not seen there before. Not pity. He would never offer her pity. But something quieter. A recognition. She looked away first. The third thing was the fever. It was minor. 2 days, a headache and a chill, nothing alarming. Eleanor stayed in her room and read and slept and was, by her own assessment, perfectly fine. Arthur did not come. Not on the first evening, when she heard him in the corridor, and his footsteps continued past her door without slowing. Not on the second, when she was well enough to wonder about it. He sent word through Mrs. Beale, "His Grace hopes you are feeling better," which was correct and kind, and delivered by someone else. On the third morning, she came down to breakfast, and he looked up from his correspondence and said, "You look better." "Good," and returned to his letter. She sat down and poured her tea. She understood by now the shape of what this marriage was. Arthur was a decent man who had wanted a wife and had acquired one and was satisfied with the acquisition. He did not know how to tend to a person. He had never learned. This was not cruelty. She was certain of that. But the effect of it was the same regardless of the intention behind it. She drank her tea and did not think about the 2 evenings his footsteps had gone past her door. She did not think about it at all. The library had become theirs, without either of them deciding it. Not simultaneously. They were not yet at the point of seeking each other out, or not admitting to it. But after the rain and the groundskeeper's cottage, they had stopped pretending it was coincidence. Nicholas read at the desk. Eleanor read in the chair by the window. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Both were easy, which was itself a thing worth noticing. She told him about the South Corridor, not as a complaint, just told it as a fact, because it was there between them, and they had passed the point of pretending things weren't. Nicholas listened. Then, "He's been the authority here for 30 years. He doesn't know how to share that. I'm not trying to take it from him. I know, he doesn't." She looked at him. "Do you tell him that?" A small pause. "We don't talk about you." "Why not?" He looked back at his book. "Because I'm not certain I could do it without bias." She didn't ask him what he meant. She thought she knew. She filed it carefully away. They walked in the afternoon sometimes. It began without planning. She was heading to the orchard, and he was going in the same direction, and neither of them invented a reason not to walk together. Then it happened again. Then it was simply a thing that happened, the way the library had become a thing that happened, by accumulated fact rather than agreement. He was different on those walks, less defended. He talked about the estate with a knowledge that surprised her. He knew this land as well as Arthur did, had absorbed it over 20 years. He talked about the tenants by name. He noticed the same things she noticed. "You love this place," she said one afternoon. "I didn't choose to," he said. "It happened while I wasn't paying attention." She understood this. She was, she realized with some alarm, beginning to understand most things he said. It was on one of those walks, the orchard, late afternoon, October, light going golden through the trees, that he told her about Arthur. They had been talking about something else, and then they weren't. The way conversations shift when the real subject has been waiting long enough. He said something to me when I was 12, Nicholas said. They were walking slowly, not looking at each other. I had been here about a year. I had not been easy. I broke a window. On purpose. I don't remember why. Arthur came to find me. I was certain he was going to send me away. I had been certain of it for a year, that there was a threshold I would cross, and then I would be sent back. Eleanor said nothing. He sat down on the floor next to me. This man, Arthur, in his own house, on the floor. And he said, "You are the only family I have left. That means I am yours, whether you want me or not." And then he got up and went to arrange for the window to be repaired. He never mentioned it again. Eleanor looked at the trees. "I believed him," Nicholas said. "I still do." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. "That is why this is so difficult." She knew what he meant. She did not ask him to clarify. "You love him," she said. "Yes. And yet, here you are." "And yet," he said, "here I am." They walked in silence the rest of the way back. At the garden gate, they went separate directions without discussing it. Her mother's letter arrived on a Wednesday. Not to Eleanor. To Arthur. She knew this because Arthur's manner changed that evening. A new distance, small but measurable. The way a temperature drops by 2 degrees, and the whole room feels different. He was not unkind. He was simply further away than he had been the day before, and she could not account for it. She wrote to her mother that night. "What did you say to him?" The reply came 4 days later. "Only that I worry about you, darling. You seem unsettled. I mentioned that you spend a great deal of time with his nephew, and I wasn't certain it was wise. I said it only because I care." Eleanor read the letter once. She had been angry at her mother before. A lifetime of it, low and chronic, like a sound you stop hearing because it never stops. But this was different. This was her mother moving pieces on a board Eleanor hadn't known she was sitting on. Going to Arthur directly, using the language of concern, of love, to hand him something he would carry without knowing where it had come from. She put the letter in the fire. "I said it only because I care." Her mother had never, not once, done anything, only because she cared. Eleanor understood this now with the absolute clarity of someone who has finally stopped hoping she is wrong. The evening light was nearly gone when she found Nicholas in the garden. He was at the far end, near the old wall, looking at the fields beyond the gate. She walked toward him without deciding to. He heard her coming and turned, and didn't seem surprised. The sky was doing something extraordinary. Deep rose and gray, and a thin line of gold at the horizon. The kind of evening that seems to be making a point. She wanted to tell him about her mother's letter. She didn't. She wanted to ask him what he had meant. That is why this is so difficult. Though she knew what he had meant. She didn't ask that either. There was a great deal between them suddenly that neither of them was saying. "I should go in," he said finally. "Yes." He turned and walked back toward the house. She watched him go. The set of his shoulders. The particular way he moved. Things she had learned without intending to. At the door, he paused. He didn't look back. But he paused, just for a moment. And she had the sense that he was doing the same thing she was. Standing at the edge of something and looking at it steadily, not yet deciding what to do. Then he went inside. Eleanor stayed where she was. The gold line at the horizon faded. The fields went dark. She stood in the cooling evening air and looked at the door he had gone through and felt the full, quiet weight of knowing something she could not unknow. She had not said it. He had not said it. But the garden knew. The evening knew. And so she was very much afraid, did she? The library was quiet. Eleanor had been there for an hour, long enough that the fire had settled from flame into steady heat, long enough that she had read the same page 3 times without retaining a word. Outside, the wind had come up. She could hear it in the old chimneys, a low, intermittent sound, like something trying to get in. She heard the door. Nicholas came in the way he always did, without announcement, with the ease of someone who had used this room for years before she arrived. He went to the desk, opened a drawer, looked for something. The Hartley survey. Arthur wanted it this morning, and I thought I'd left it here. Second shelf, left side, behind the estate ledgers. A pause. He looked. Found it. Thank you. He should have left then. He had what he came for. He stayed. She turned a page she hadn't read. Eleanor. Something in the way he said it, not a question, just her name, just that, made her look up. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the careful blankness, not the guarded attention. Something that had gotten past all of that. Are you happy here? He asked. The fire shifted. A log settled. Somewhere in the house, a door closed in the wind. She opened her mouth. The correct answer was ready. Had always been ready. She had been giving it for months. Very much so. Arthur is very kind. The estate is beautiful. Nothing came out. The silence went on long enough to become its own answer. Nicholas set the survey down on the desk. He took one step toward her. Then he stopped. She watched him make the decision to stop, watched it cost him something, and the room felt very small and very still. I should not be asking you this, he said. No, she said. You should not. Neither of them moved. He picked up the survey. Good night, he said. Good night. He left. The door clicked shut. Eleanor understood that something had been spoken in this room that could not be unspoken. Not the words. The words were almost nothing. But what had lived inside them? What had passed between one person and another in the space where a correct answer had failed to appear? She closed the book and sat for a long time in the quiet room and did not try to think her way out of it. Arthur summoned her the following morning. Not asked. Summoned. A note sent to her room, formal and brief. She went. He was standing when she arrived, which told her everything about the conversation before it began. Arthur sat when things were going well. He stood when he had decided something. Close the door, he said. She took the chair across from his desk, because she wasn't going to stand through this, and she folded her hands in her lap and waited. I want to speak to you about Nicholas. All right. I'm aware that you spend a considerable amount of time in his company, walking, the library. He said it without accusation, which was almost worse. He said it the way he said everything, evenly, from a great and reasonable height. I want to understand whether there is something I should know. We talk, Eleanor said. That is all. He is the only other person in this house, Arthur. When you are with Hartley, when you are with the tenants, there is no one else to speak to. I understand. He paused. Nevertheless. She looked at him, this good, careful, distant man, and felt very tired. I've done nothing wrong, she said. I'm not suggesting you have. He moved to the window, stood with his back to her, looking out at the grounds he loved and understood, and managed so much better than he managed anything with a heartbeat. I'm simply asking you to be mindful of appearances, of what is appropriate. He turned. You are my wife, Eleanor. I should like you to remember what that means. She looked at him, I should like you to remember what that means. And she thought, I have remembered nothing else since the morning I walked into your study and said, all right. But what he said next was worse. I did not marry you for conversation, Eleanor. He said it simply, without malice, as though it were a clarification, something she might have misunderstood and now need not. The room was very quiet. No, she said. I don't suppose you did. She stood, smoothed her dress, walked to the door with the steadiness her mother had spent 22 years building into her spine. Eleanor, she paused. I do care for you, Arthur said. And she believed him. That was the thing. She still believed him. But she understood at last the precise dimensions of what that caring was. Wide enough to furnish her rooms and remember her books, not deep enough to come to her door. I know, she said. She closed the door behind her, walked to her room, and stood at the window looking at the orchard. She did not cry. She had not cried since before the wedding, but something inside her went very still and very cold, the way water goes still before it freezes. She had known this. She had always known it. But there is a difference between knowing something and being told it, plainly, by the person it concerns. Something had ended in that study. Not the marriage. Marriages like this one did not end cleanly. But some last remaining question about what this was. Some final possibility she had not known she was still carrying. It was gone now. Her mother came the next day. Not invited. She simply arrived. The way she had learned to arrive at things. She found Eleanor in the morning room and said, without preamble, I hear Arthur spoke to you. Eleanor looked at her. I only told him because I was concerned. The way you've been spending time with Nicholas Vane, people notice, Eleanor. I could not in good conscience stay silent. In good conscience, Eleanor said. You are a married woman. If you were to lose Arthur's regard, what would happen, Mama? She said it quietly. Tell me exactly. A pause. Her mother's expression shifted. Just slightly, the composed surface rippling the way it did when something had gotten closer than she intended to allow. I am afraid for you. That is all. I am your mother. Eleanor looked at her, really looked, directly and without the old flinching hope. And she saw it. She had always seen it, she supposed. But there had always been some residual warmth she kept finding, because she needed it to be there. It wasn't there. There was a woman across from her who had arranged her daughter's marriage and collected rent from it, and reported back to the landlord when the asset behaved unexpectedly. A woman who used the word mother the way she used all words, as currency, as instrument, as the right tool for the effect she needed. You should go, Eleanor said. Her mother's eyes widened. Eleanor, I mean it, Mama. Not angry, just finished. I will write to you, but I need you to go. Her mother went, not without a performance. There were wounded eyes and a quiet comment about ingratitude meant to follow Eleanor up the stairs. But she went. Eleanor stood in the morning room after she heard the carriage and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, the particular lightness of a decision made and meant. Nicholas found her in the garden that afternoon. Or she found him. She was never entirely certain afterward who had been looking for whom. He came around the corner of the old wall and stopped when he saw her. I owe you an apology, he said. Arthur said something to you. I know he did. If my behavior has caused you difficulty, I'll keep my distance, if that would— Nicholas. She said it more firmly, and he stopped. It is not your fault. Eleanor, none of this was ever my choice. Not the marriage. Not this house. She stopped. Steadied. I want you to understand that. Before you take responsibility for something that was never yours to carry. And so she told him, not everything at once. It came in pieces. The way true things do when you have not said them out loud before. The accounts, the solicitor, the 3 months and the £400, the letters her mother had intercepted, the morning she had walked into her mother's room and said all right, and watched her mother's face transform. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer reassurances, reframings, the small, comfortable lies of someone who wants the story to be less than it is. When she finished, the garden was very quiet. "I knew you did not come here freely," he said at last. "Yes, but I did not know how little freedom you had. No one did. That was rather the point." He looked at her, the look from the rain, from the groundskeeper's cottage, the look that had no performance in it. "What Arthur said to you, yesterday." She shook her head slightly. She was not going to say it. She didn't need to. He understood. She could see him understand, and see what that did to him, something moving behind his eyes that he controlled, but couldn't quite eliminate. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "Not yet." He closed his mouth. They stood facing each other in the autumn garden, and there was something between them that had no name yet, or had a name neither of them was saying, and the distance between them was not very large, and not getting any larger. "I should have gone when Arthur wanted to send me to London," he said finally. "Last spring. I found reasons to stay. I told myself it was the estate, that he needed me here. Maybe he did. Maybe." His eyes didn't leave hers. "That wasn't why I stayed." The admission dropped between them, quiet and irreversible. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had been learning for months without meaning to, at the man who had told her the truth when no one else had, who had seen what she was and not looked away from it. "I know," she said softly. The garden held them. Neither of them moved. Something had to happen now. She could feel it, the pressure of it, the way a storm feels before the first drop falls. But the step was very large, and they were standing at the edge of it. And, "Not yet," he said. She blinked. He was almost smiling. Not quite, but almost. The particular expression she had come to watch for. "You said it first." "I did. So we're agreed." "We're agreed." He nodded once, as though something had been settled. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, and she stayed where she was, and the garden was very quiet, and she understood with absolute certainty that not yet is not the same thing as no, not even close. The letter arrived on a Monday, and by Thursday it had changed everything. Eleanor found out the way she found out most things in this house, not directly, not from Arthur, but sideways, through the particular silence that fell over a room when she entered it. Mrs. Beale's careful neutrality at breakfast, Arthur's studied absorption in his correspondence, the quality of the air that told her something had been decided without her. She found the letter itself by accident, on Arthur's desk, while leaving a household account he had asked for. She did not read it. She saw 3 lines before she understood what it was and set it down. But 3 lines were enough. Her mother's handwriting. Arthur's name at the top. "I have hesitated to write this, as it causes me great pain, but I believe you must know. I have observed, on more than one occasion, behavior between Eleanor and Mr. Vane, that no wife should—" She put the letter down. She stood very still in the study, looking at her mother's handwriting, and felt something move through her that was beyond anger, something colder and more absolute, the feeling of a door closing on a room she would never enter again. Then she went to find Arthur. He was in the stables. He looked up when she came in, handed the horse to the groom without being asked, and walked with her to the far end of the yard, out of earshot. "You've seen the letter," he said. 3 lines of it. Then you know what she has written. I know what she has implied. Eleanor looked at him steadily. It is not true, Arthur. I want to believe that. Then believe it, because it is the truth. He was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the fields, always the fields, the one place he knew how to look when he did not know how to look at a person. The difficulty, he said, is that it does not matter. She stared at him. Whether it is true or not, the appearance exists. Your mother has observed something. Others may have also. He turned to face her, his expression reasonable, measured, entirely convinced of its own correctness. I cannot have that conversation with my neighbors, Eleanor. I will not have my house be the subject of that kind of talk. I've asked Nicholas to go to London. There is business there. Legitimate business. You're sending him away. I'm asking him to give us time to— You are punishing him for something he did not do, because my mother wrote you a letter full of implications she cannot substantiate, and your primary concern is what your neighbors will say. Her voice was very even. She had her mother to thank for that, at least. Arthur, look at me. He looked at her. My mother has been managing this marriage since before it began. She intercepted my correspondence when I was trying to find another way out. She reported to you when she felt her position was threatened. This letter is not concern. It is self-preservation. She held his gaze. She is afraid that if I find any kind of happiness here, she will lose her access to your money. That is the whole of it. Something moved through his expression. Doubt, she thought, or the beginning of it. Then it settled back. Whatever the reason, he said, appearances must be maintained. The yard was very quiet. One of the horses shifted in its stall. The wind moved through the old oak at the corner of the fence. Appearances must be maintained. She had known, she supposed, that it would end here. At this sentence, or one like it. She had known since the study. Since I did not marry you for conversation, had known even since the very beginning. Since the morning she walked into her mother's room and said, "All right." She had been waiting, without admitting she was waiting, for the moment it finally showed her its limit. Here it was. "Then I cannot stay," she said. Arthur went very still. She watched the words arrive, watched him understand that she did not mean in this conversation, but the other, larger, irreversible thing. And she saw something happen in his face that she had never seen before. He saw her, for the first time perhaps, as something other than a role she occupied, as a person who had limits and had reached them. "Eleanor, you are a good man," she said, and she meant it. She had always meant it, would always mean it. "You have been, in your way, kind to me. I want you to know that I understand that." She paused. "But I have been a piece of furniture in this house. A well-chosen, well-maintained piece of furniture. And I cannot—" Her voice stayed even. Her mother's training held, right to the end. "I cannot be that for the rest of my life." Arthur said nothing. She turned and walked back to the house. She went to her mother first. Her mother looked up when Eleanor came in with the expression of someone who believes they are about to have the right conversation. "Eleanor, darling, I read the letter," Eleanor said. A pause. Something careful moved through her mother's eyes. "I wrote it out of concern." "Stop." Eleanor sat down across from her, because she was not going to give this the drama her mother would want. "I am not going to argue with you about what you intended. It doesn't matter anymore. I am done. With this. With being managed. With my correspondence being intercepted, and my husband being reported to, and my life being arranged around what is useful to you." She looked at her mother, at the face she had been trying to read correctly for 22 years. "It is finished, Mama. I will not be taking your counsel anymore, about anything." Her mother's face went through several things in quick succession: hurt, calculation, and then, reaching for the most reliable instrument, tears. "After everything I have done for you, after everything I sacrificed, please don't. I am your mother, Eleanor. I have only ever—" "I know what you have only ever done." Eleanor stood. Her voice had not changed, not once. She was rather proud of that. "Goodbye, Mama. If you walk out of this room—" "Yes," said Eleanor. "I know." She walked out. In the corridor, she stopped for a moment, her hand flat against the wall, and breathed. Then she went upstairs. Nicholas's door was open. She saw it from the corridor, the particular openness of a room being emptied, a bag on the bed, a coat folded over the chair. She stood in the frame and looked at it, and the reality of it arrived with a weight she had not quite prepared for. He came out of the dressing room and stopped when he saw her. "Arthur told me this morning," he said. "I know." He went back to folding the coat, because he was Nicholas, and he did things with his hands when he didn't know what to do with the rest of himself. "It's all right. London is— there is legitimate work there. I've been meaning to go for some time. Nicholas. The arrangements make sense, honestly. I should have— Nicholas." He stopped folding the coat. She came into the room. She stood a few feet from him, and she looked at him, at the carefully constructed composure, at the thing underneath it that was not composed at all. And she felt very clearly and without confusion what she felt. "Don't go," she said. Just that. He went very still. The room was quiet. Outside, the afternoon light was going gold across the fields. Somewhere downstairs, a clock was ticking, the old one in the hall that had been ticking in this house since before either of them was born. He turned to look at her. "Eleanor," he said. Her name, just her name, in the voice he used when he had stopped being careful. "I know what I'm saying," she said. "I know what it means." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the coat down on the bed, very slowly, like a man who has made a decision and is making sure he means it. "So do I," he said. She went back to her room. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the moon move across the sky and thought about all of it. Arthur's face in the yard, her mother's tears, Nicholas setting down the coat. And she felt, underneath the fear and the enormity of it, something she had not felt in a very long time. Certainty, not the false certainty of a morning when she had said all right, because there was no other answer. The real kind, the kind that comes from knowing, finally and without qualification, what you are and what you will not be. She was not furniture. She was not her mother's instrument. She was not the Duchess of Ashford, or not only that, or not for much longer. She was Eleanor, and she was 22 years old, and somewhere down the corridor a man had put down a coat because she had asked him to, and the night was long, but it was not, she thought, going to last forever. At 11:30 she heard a footstep in the corridor. It stopped outside her door. A pause. Then, very quietly, a knock. She stood up. She took very little. A traveling bag, small enough to carry herself. 2 dresses, practical ones. Her warmest coat. The money she had been quietly setting aside for 3 months. Not much, but enough. In an envelope at the bottom of her writing case. Her mother had taught her, without meaning to, that a woman should always have something that was only hers. She moved through the dark room without a candle, because she had lived in this house long enough to know it by feel. The floorboard near the window, the slight catch on the wardrobe door, the particular creak of the 3rd step that she had been avoiding for months. She avoided it now. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped. The house was quiet around her, the deep, breathing quiet of a place full of sleeping people, of fires banked and clocks ticking and lives continuing without her. She stood in the entrance hall and looked at it. The stone floor, the high ceiling, the portraits of Ashfords going back 2 centuries, watching her from the walls with their painted indifference. She had tried in this house. She wanted to remember that. She had tried to learn it and tend it and be useful to it, and it had not wanted what she had to offer. She opened the front door and went out. Nicholas was in the yard, 2 horses already saddled. He was standing at their heads in the dark, and when she came through the door, he looked at her once, taking in the bag, the coat, all of it, and something in his face went very still and very certain. No words. There were no words adequate to this moment, and they both knew it. She went to her horse. He helped her mount without being asked, his hand briefly at her elbow, and then they were moving, across the yard, through the gate, down the long drive between the oaks she had walked so many times, and Eleanor did not look back until they reached the road. Then she did. The house sat on its hill in the dark, windows blank, utterly still, the same as it had always been. It did not know she was leaving, or it knew and did not care, which amounted to the same thing. She turned away. They rode north. The night was cold and very long. No conversation, not at first, just the sound of hooves on road, the occasional shape of a tree against a slightly lighter sky, the wind coming from somewhere ahead that felt like it had never been warm. Eleanor concentrated on staying in the saddle, on the cold in her hands, on the road unreeling ahead of them in the dark. She had made a decision. She was living inside it now, and it was nothing like the moment of making it. The moment had been clear and certain and almost weightless. This, the actual road, the actual cold, the actual not knowing what comes next, was something else entirely. They stopped at a crossroads 2 hours in to rest the horses. Nicholas held the map in the moonlight, tracing the route with one finger, and she stood beside him and looked at the lines on the paper that represented the distance between where they were and somewhere no one knew them. It was a very long distance. He folded the map. He looked at her. In the moonlight, she could see that he was as tired as she was, and as cold, and as entirely without certainty about what came next. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She almost laughed, not from humor, but from the accuracy of it, from the relief of being asked a true question by someone who wanted a true answer. "Terribly," she said. "You?" "Yes." Just that. No reassurance, no brave face, no performance of confidence, neither of them felt. Just 2 people standing at a crossroads in the dark, telling each other the truth. It was, she thought, the most intimate thing she had ever experienced. They got back on the horses and rode on. In the gray hour before dawn, she found herself thinking about the shape of it, her life and his, and the particular way they had arrived at this road together. Nicholas had come to Ashford Manor at 11 years old, with nothing but a name and a grief he was too young to understand, and had been given everything, a home, an education, a place, and had somehow remained a man without a place. The house had never been his. The name had never quite been his. He had spent 20 years being grateful for what he had been given, and unable to quite believe he was allowed to keep it. She had grown up in a house with a mother who loved her, or performed loving her, and perhaps that had been the same thing once before the money ran out. She had been shaped by all of it into something useful to someone else. Both of them, she thought. Both of them had lived their whole lives in houses that belonged to other people. Both of them had learned to be grateful for rooms they were not quite sure they were allowed to occupy. She looked at Nicholas riding beside her in the early light, the set of his jaw, the exhaustion he was not bothering to hide because there was no one to hide it from anymore, and felt the strange, clarifying tenderness of knowing someone truly. Not the version they present, the actual person underneath. He had seen her from the very beginning, more accurately than anyone else had. He had told her hard truths when it would have been easier to be kind. He had stayed when he should have left, for reasons he had finally admitted. She had done the same. They were, she supposed, rather alike in the ways that mattered. Morning came slowly, the light arriving from behind clouds in a thin, reluctant way, as though it wasn't entirely sure the day was a good idea. At the estate, Mrs. Beale found the note Eleanor had left on the hall table. 2 sentences, addressed to Arthur, saying only that she had gone, and that she was sorry for the manner of it if not the fact. She had meant what she said about him being a good man. She had not been able to muster an apology for the going itself. Arthur read the note in his study, alone. He sat for a long time afterward without moving. He did not send anyone after them. This was perhaps the most generous thing he ever did for her, understanding, with the quiet intelligence he had always had, that a search would become a scandal, and that Eleanor, whatever she had done, did not deserve to be caught and brought back like something escaped. He had his dignity. He allowed her hers. He spent the day in his fields, which was where he went when the world required him to be, somewhere he could manage it. His estate manager found him at the north boundary at 4 o'clock, walking the fence line with the dogs, and had the wisdom not to mention anything that had happened. They walked in silence, and Arthur looked at his land, and if he was thinking about a young woman who had read his estate records cover to cover and noticed a broken window seal and tried, in her careful way, to tend the place she had been placed in, well, that was his own business. Her mother received the news by letter. She read it in the small sitting room in Mayfair, with the French clock ticking on the mantelpiece and the blue china dogs watching from the shelf, and she sat with it for a long time. She had not expected this, or perhaps she had, somewhere beneath the calculations, had known, in the way you know things you refuse to examine, that Eleanor had a limit, and that she had been pressing against it for 22 years, and that limits eventually give. She had thought she knew her daughter. Sitting alone in the room she had arranged so carefully, she considered the possibility that she had never known her at all, that the Eleanor she thought she understood, manageable, dutiful, ultimately persuadable, had been a fiction she had required, and Eleanor had, until now, provided. Arthur would continue the allowance. She would not starve. She would not lose the flat, or the clock, or the dogs. She had everything she had arranged to have. She sat alone in her well-appointed room and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular cold of getting what you wanted. They reached the town at mid-morning. Harwick was small, a market square, a church with a leaning spire, a scattering of stone buildings that looked as though they had been there long enough to stop caring about newcomers. It was nothing like London, nothing like the estate, nothing like anywhere either of them had been before. That was rather the point. They left the horses at the inn and found a table outside the tavern across the square. The morning was cold, but the sun had come out, watery and thin, doing its best. A woman brought them tea without being asked, looked at them with the incurious appraisal of someone accustomed to seeing people arrive from somewhere and not asking where, and went back inside. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the heat move through her gloves. She looked at the square, the market stalls just opening, a dog leap against a wall, a child crossing the cobblestones with a basket, looking very serious about it. Ordinary life, going about its business, entirely indifferent to the two people sitting outside the tavern with their traveling bags and their complicated history and their complete absence of a plan. Nicholas set down his cup. "What do we do now?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She kept looking at the square, at the ordinary, irreducible fact of a place that did not know her name or her mother's ambitions or the portrait gallery of Ashford Manor, a place where she was no one yet, a place where she could possibly become someone of her own choosing. She turned to look at Nicholas, tired, honest, the most unperformed version of himself she had ever seen, and felt, underneath the fear and the cold and the enormity of what they had done, something that was almost like relief. "We figure it out," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, once, as though this were a perfectly adequate answer to an impossible question. Because it was. Because it was the only answer that had ever been true, and they had both spent their whole lives waiting for someone to say it plainly. The sun came out a little further. The child crossed the square. The tea went cold, and they ordered more, and the morning continued around them, and they let it. Years later, if you had asked either of them to name the hardest part, they would have given different answers. Eleanor would have said the first winter. The small rented rooms above a chandler's shop in Harwick, the wind finding every gap in the old walls, the mornings when the reality of what she had left arrived before she was fully awake and sat on her chest until she made herself get up and light the fire and do the next necessary thing. She had never been fragile, but she had also never been tested quite like that, without money or position or a single person in that town who owed her anything, building a life from nothing with her hands. Nicholas would have said the letters. Arthur wrote to him once, 6 months after, a single page in his careful hand that said very little and meant a great deal. Nicholas read it in the chandler's kitchen, while Eleanor was at the school where she had begun, quietly and without announcement, to help with the younger children's reading. He read it twice and then folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, and did not speak of it that evening, and Eleanor did not ask. She knew what it cost him. She had always known. The scandal followed them, of course. These things do, and Victorian England was not a country that forgot quickly or forgave easily. Some doors never opened. Some names from their former lives were never spoken again. There was a period of 2 years when it seemed that every new acquaintance they made would eventually learn who they were and decide what to do with that information. And the deciding was always visible, always uncomfortable, and sometimes went the wrong way. But Harwick was a practical town. It cared more about whether a person was useful than about what they had left behind. Nicholas built a modest legal practice, modest at first, then less so, because he was good and thorough and charged fairly, and word travels in small towns. Eleanor taught at the school for a year, then 2. Then took on the older students, then quietly began to run the place with the same systematic competence she had brought to every broken household she had ever lived in. Only this time, no one told her not to trouble herself with it. Her mother died in the spring of Eleanor's 25th year. The letter came from the solicitor, brief, correct, as most of their communications had been. Eleanor sat with it for an evening and felt many things that were not simple and refused to be made simple, and Nicholas sat with her and did not try to make them simple either. The last letter between Eleanor and her mother had been 4 lines, cold and necessary, about the disposal of a few personal effects. Eleanor had the blue china dog sent to Harwick. She was not sure why. She put them on the mantelpiece and looked at them sometimes, and did not explain them to anyone. Arthur Ashford, by all accounts, never remarried. He lived at the estate and managed his land with the same quiet devotion he had always had, and was considered by his neighbors to be a good man, which he was. Eleanor hoped he was not unhappy. She believed most of the time that he was not, that he had his fields and his dogs, and his margin notes in his poetry books, and that this was for him most of what life needed to be. She hoped he had fixed the south corridor window. The years settled into each other, as years do. There were hard ones and easier ones, and one or two that were genuinely good from beginning to end, which surprised her every time, as though she had not quite believed such a thing was available to her. Nicholas's practice grew. She started a small lending library from the school, which became a slightly larger lending library, which became eventually a room in the town hall, with her name above the door in modest letters that she found embarrassing, and Nicholas found entirely appropriate. They argued sometimes. They were two people who had strong opinions and had spent years learning to suppress them, and occasionally the suppression gave way, and the opinions came out at full volume, and the walls of whatever room they were in were probably grateful when it was over. They repaired these arguments with the same practical thoroughness they brought to everything else. Neither of them was given to lingering in damage. They had both had enough of that. What she remembered, in the end, was not the difficulty, though the difficulty had been real, and she would not pretend otherwise. What she remembered was the quality of being known, of living with a person who had seen her clearly from the very beginning and had not looked away, who had told her hard truths in cold gardens and listened to her tell harder ones in return, and had stayed through all of it, present. She had spent the first 22 years of her life in houses that did not belong to her. She spent the rest of it in one that did. It was not a perfect life, but it was hers. And at the end of a long day, when the fire was lit and the lending library was locked, and Nicholas was reading in the chair across from hers, still reading, always reading, a man who had never quite gotten over the relief of being allowed to take books from shelves that belonged to him, she would look at the blue china dogs on the mantelpiece and think, yes, this is what I chose. And the choosing had made all the difference. We've reached the end of the story, and honestly, this one stayed with me. I'd really like to hear what you thought, so feel free to share your thoughts, and let me know where you're watching from. Thank you for listening all the way through, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next story.